Hi, many of you have requested to me to do this video, so I'm gonna do it. How to shoot in the dark.
From listening to records, I just knew what to do. I mainly taught myself. And, you know, I did pretty well, except there were a few mistakes that I made that I have just recently cleared up. You know.
So, shooting in the dark. I think there's three aspects. You have the gear, you have the creative side on like how and what to shoot, and then you have the settings on the camera. And let's go through them. Let's go through the gear and the creative stuff, and then let's go to the computer and let's compare different settings on the camera, because I did some tests around my place, testing different settings and seeing what kind of quality can we get with the GH5. This video is about half generic stuff related to shooting in the dark, and half is specifically the GH5. Let's talk about gear. So when we're talking about gear, there's two parts, the body and the lens. And for example, this camera, the GH5 that I'm shooting this video right now, and these test clips that I shot around my house, the GH5 is not considered a very low light capable camera. But because I'm using very fast lenses, I'm able to keep the ISO rather low, so I'm getting a very clean image even with the not so capable GH5. Of course, the sensitivity of the sensor affects how well you can shoot, but I think the lenses are much more important. So for example, this lens is 1.8, so it's rather fast. And the lens that I'm shooting this right now is an old Nikon 1.4 lens, and that lens is even faster than this. The f number is lower, but there's one thing as well. This is a prime lens and this is a zoom lens. So it means that there is much more glass between the front of the lens and the sensor in this lens than with this lens. The more glass light has to travel through, the less light will hit the sensor. So this 1.8 glass, prime glass, is much faster than this 1.8 glass. And then I guess it's kind of like part of the camera or part of the lens, but I'm using these Metabone speed boosters. These are kind of like magnifying glasses for the lenses. It will concentrate light, it will increase the amount of light that hits the sensor.
The music's coming through, music's coming through, music's coming through, music's coming through.
So then let's talk about settings. And when we're talking about settings, there's basically three things that will affect your exposure: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So when we're deciding how to compose our exposure using these three different parts, I would say that I aim to have my ISO as low as possible. So for example, I'll open up my lens as wide as it can go, and then I'll get my shutter speed as low as it can go. For example, most of these clips that I shot are shot in the shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. So that's twice as slow as normally recommended for shooting video, but because there isn't much movement in the shots, I think I can get away with that. And then I open my lenses up as much as I could. So then most of these clips are shot with the ISO of 800. So by this, I'm getting a very clean image, even in a very dim situation like this.
And I would like to be able to continue to let what is inside of me, which comes from all the music that I hear, and I'd like for that to come out. And it's like, it's not really me that's coming, the music's coming through me.
And then let me share a couple of ideas from the creative side of shooting in the dark. For example, I'll set my exposure so that I'm protecting my highlights. I don't mind that my shadows go dark. Well, that's the point of shadows, being dark. But protecting the highlight is much more important because, for example, the night scene in these clips, there's so many different lights with different colors. So I want to protect my highlights so that I can reserve the color of them. And another creative tip is that I like to shoot reflections. For example, reflections from the water or from the wet ground or from sides of cars. I think reflections are more interesting than the light sources that the reflections are coming from. And the intensity of the reflections is much lower than the origin, the light source itself. So when I'm shooting a reflection, I can have the color and the feel of the light, but I don't have to crush my shadows too much. It's getting cold, so let me try and explain the last idea. So the idea is here that think about two frames. So you have a frame number one, that everything in the frame is dark. And frame number two, you have darkness, but you have some light sources and reflections. So I would say that the first frame, where everything is dark, your exposure is not correct. But if you have some light sources, some reflections, some contrast, something to make the frame dark, then it's not your exposure, it's just a dark frame. And if there's no contrast between dark and shadow, so there's no light, then it's just that your exposure is not correct. So try to have some light in your frame so that your frame is dark by design, not by bad decision on exposure. Now let's look into the clips on the computer. And here in Premiere I have these 4 groups of clips. Inside each of these groups there is 4 clips, and each of these clips have been shot with a different profile or different resolution. These 2 clips are 6K, these are 4K. The under row is Vivid and the top row is Vlog. And I chose Vivid to represent the normal profiles because, well, it's the most vivid, so the most colorful. And let's look into the footage. So now we're looking at Vivid and now we're looking at Vlog. So if I toggle this eyeball on, you can see Vivid and Vlog. And Vivid, of course, seems to have less dynamic range than Vlog, and the colors in Vlog are more realistic, I think. But then let's zoom in 400% and let's look at the noise. So here you can see the noise pattern of Vlog in 4K. This is 4K, and now look at the same thing in 6K. And for my eye, it really seems that the noise is much less visible in 6K than in 4K. Interesting. Okay, next clip. This one is Vlog, and now we're looking at Vivid. And you can really see that Vivid has much less dynamic range than Vlog. The shadows are more crushed, and the highlights are almost blowing out. Or actually, some of them are. But then something interesting. When we're comparing, this is 4K Vivid, and now we're looking at 6K Vivid. It seems that the 6K Vivid seems to have even less dynamic range. I don't know, maybe I did something wrong in the settings when I'm shooting this, but it really seems that when we're using 6K, we're losing dynamic range with the normal profiles. But then again, if we're using Vlog, so this is Vlog 4K and this is Vlog 6K, the same thing is not happening. I don't know why, but it seems that with normal profiles, at least with Vivid, the dynamic range is decreased when we're using 6K. Okay, then the next one. So this is actually interesting. Now we're looking at Vlog and 4K, and this is a rail. The same sign, this red sign, is reflecting from this wet rail, metallic rail. And this is Vlog, but when I turn off Vlog and we're looking at Vivid, this actually looks even better because there is this gradient from red to yellow. But technically, Vlog is better because the sign was red and the reflection should be red, not yellow. But this is actually because this Vivid has a narrower color space than Vlog. So Vlog has a wider color space than Vivid. And this causes that this actually, why it's turning from red to yellow, is that the saturation is clipping. But it doesn't happen with Vlog because it has a wider dynamic range. I mean, wider color space. Color space, dynamic range, 2 different things. And here, now this is 6K Vlog, and now we're looking at 6K Vivid. You can see the same thing, the saturation is clipping, but it actually looks even better. Here, you can see the same thing, this is 4K Vivid, and you can see that red sign is turning into yellow. And if we turn on Vlog, it stays red. But personally, I prefer the Vivid color. And here's the 6K Vivid and 6K Vlog. And out of these 3, I'm interested. Now it seems that the 6K is not, we are not losing a dynamic range with 6K comparing to 4K. I don't know what's that. But out of these 4, now the 6K Vivid looks the best. So to recap, 6K seems to have less noise than 4K, but with the normal profiles, at least with Vivid, sometimes for some reason you seem to lose dynamic range when using 6K when comparing to 4K. But Vlog, 6K and 4K is the same, about the same dynamic range. And then the last idea is that when we're shooting in the dark, and well in any situation, I would recommend for you to choose the color profile that you use separately for each situation. There isn't one profile to rule them all. In many cases, V-Log is better than the others because it has wider color range and more dynamic range, but that's not always the case. So for example, in shooting in the dark scenes, I would flip through different profiles and just look from the back of my camera which one looks the best and use that for that situation. Okay, that's it. See you in the next one. Bye. Tanida, you want to be my 1000th subscriber?
Absolutely.
Ooh, 1000! I apparently just reached my goal that I set to myself when I started this channel 1.5 months ago, to reach 1000 subscribers.